I think it's important to remember that confusion is not curiosity. So like curiosity can be clear. And I have this funny example. I made this butternut squash soup recently for my family, and I packed it full of like ginger, cayenne pepper, jalapeno pepper. Like it was scorching hot and nobody could eat it because they couldn't taste the flavor of it, right? So we don't want curiosity to be like that. We don't want it to be like a 5-alarm fire and people are just like, I don't know what's happening. It can be clear and make sense and guide them to the next step without us like leaving them just wanting to fan the flames in their mouth.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today on the podcast, we have Emily Aborn coming back, I believe, for a third episode. I am so excited for you to hear my conversation with Emily about creating curiosity with our podcast content. Now, this is something that obviously I think is so important in using our content to bring people into the conversation, to really be able to attract the different types of curious people that could potentially be sitting in our audience. So we go through, can we create too much curiosity? 4 types of curious people and how we can speak to each of these people, and then some things that we want to avoid and things to do instead when we're using this curiosity. All right, please join me in welcoming Emily back to the show. Hello, Emily. Thank you so much for joining me again. I believe this is the 3rd or 4th time you've been on the show at this point.
I think we're on our 4th season, Alicia. Thanks for having me back. I'm so excited.
Yes. And today we're going to be talking about curiosity in our content, creating that curiosity with the things that we're creating, like the podcast specifically. But I think that a lot of the things that we're going to talk about definitely apply to other parts of our content. But before we dive into that, if you could tell everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcast.
Sure. Thanks for that opportunity. I am Emily Aborn. I live in New Hampshire, which I think is a fun fact. And if you don't know where that is, it's a tiny little state in New England, which is near the Atlantic Ocean. Very chilly, very small state. And I love it. And I'm a content writer by trade. So I write website copy, blogs, a lot of social media content for people, as well as things like show notes and repurposing those show notes into other things. I also have a group, a community called She Built This, and that's sort of where my podcast, She Built This, was birthed from, is from the community. So it's like a place where the conversation on entrepreneurship and things like that keep on going.
I love that. And you are coming out with a new one, and I believe it will be out by the time this episode airs. So if you could tell everyone about that one as well.
Okay, so that is called Content with Character, and it is about putting us back into the driver's seat when it comes to like our marketing and our visibility and our content, and like just infusing it with the one thing that nobody can replicate, not even AI, and that is your personality.
Oh, and I love that topic so much because, I mean, if you guys listen to this podcast at any length of time, you'll know I'm very adamant about being yourself, being, I know buzzword, authentic, but being authentic on podcasts to really be able to use that to draw people into you and repel the people that you don't want to be in your space. So how does curiosity help us as business owners, as humans? Just let's go right into this.
Let's go right into it. Okay. So the topic sort of came into my awareness. I focused on it for an entire month in my content. And I was just like, oh my God, this has so many benefits for life, for business, for your relationships, for your relationship with yourself. I think that curiosity, it's kind of like this like desire or fire or pull inside of you to learn more or to deepen into some area. So when it comes to your business, it's an opportunity to look at not just like what's wrong, because we can look at things with like a very judgmental eye when it comes to anything, our relationships, our business, our life. And it's an opportunity to say like, why? and lean into that more, and then follow the pull, follow the interest to a solution or to the next steps or to connecting with somebody else. So really, it's kind of like this internal like fire that leads you. And if you are led by curiosity, you will find like just taking those small steps one after the other, you end up and you look back and you're like, I have no idea how I got here, but I am so happy I did. I'm going to use you and I as an example. Actually, like our relationship has been built on curiosity. Like I sat down with Alicia the very first time. I don't even remember when. I was curious about her as a person. She was curious about me as a person. We're curious about what we offer. We bring it together and we just keep following that thread. And look where we are now.
I know. Like at this point, we will have launched or almost launched a podcast together. Like there's so many collaborations. I'm having my team go to one of your workshops. Like there's a lot that can happen when you follow that curiosity. Whereas if we let ourselves, because of whatever, whether it's past feelings or past situations that have happened, or we're just like busy, right? Like I know we're all busy. I get it. But if you don't let yourself be curious and follow that curiosity, then you're not going to be able to open yourself up to the possibilities of what can happen and what could happen in the relationships that you can build. And yes, there are going to be those things that aren't great, right? Like that happen. You're like, man, I really wish I wouldn't have followed that one.
That's why they say curiosity killed the cat, because it most certainly can.
Yes, exactly. But in our content, it is important. And when we are talking about our content, why is creating that curiosity important?
So I think there's twofold reasons. So that fire, that desire, that interest that I was talking about, it's really powerful when you can invoke that in somebody else and they just genuinely want to get to know you and work with you because they're like, I am interested in this individual. I am interested in the human being on the other side of this business. Secondly, we're bombarded by content in so many forms constantly. And like the way to stand out from all that noise is to get somebody to stop the scroll, if you want to say it in those terms, lean in and like want to learn more from you. So we can use it as podcasters and content creators to our advantage to kind of get somebody to be like, oh, I'm just interested in this human being. Now I want to take the next step and follow my curiosity.
I think pulling something you said is really important here in creating that curiosity on how they can then take that next step. Because so often I see content creators, podcasters, they're creating this curiosity, or maybe they're just feeding this curiosity, and then they're not doing anything with it or encouraging their audience to take the next step, to engage with them, to comment below, whatever. It's just, hey, here's this thing because someone told me I needed to do this. This is where I really want to make sure that as business owners, we are using our content to take that next step. Like really remember that, guys, as we're kind of going through these things. I think that's really important to remember.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that confusion is not curiosity. So like curiosity can be clear. And I have this funny example. I made this butternut squash soup recently for my family and I packed it full of like ginger, cayenne pepper, jalapeno pepper. Like it was scorching hot and nobody could eat it because they couldn't taste the flavor of it, right? So we don't want curiosity to be like that. We don't want it to be like a 5-alarm fire and people are just like, I don't know what's happening. It can be clear and make sense and guide them to the next step without us like leaving them just wanting to fan the flames in their mouth.
Yeah. So how do we do that in our content? How do we create that curiosity without feeling like super overwhelmed?
I think this is a good place to start. A good place to start. Well, first, a really good place to start is knowing who you're talking to, right? So we're all speaking to kind of a different ideal client, different type of, maybe a couple of different ideal clients. So really understanding your audience and like where they are, what their pain points are, what their frustrations are, what their challenges are, what lights them up is really, really important. But one question I absolutely love, and this is not an original thought. I got this from Mignon Fogarty, who was on my podcast. She's host of the Grammar Girl podcast. She asks herself when it comes to her content, would I follow me? Would I be interested in this content? Would I engage with this content? And I love that as a starting point. I have had podcasts that I've sat down and recorded, like maybe a solo episode, right? And I just didn't feel the energy in it. And like I got to the end, I was like, what did I even say? I will redo it. Because I'm like, if I heard this podcast episode, I'd be like, skip. So that's a really good place to start is like, would I be interested in listening to content like this from somebody else? And don't say yes just because it's you. We all like to hear ourselves talk, but yes is not always the answer.
Unless you're Alicia, me, who does
Alicia,
not like to hear herself talk.
oh, that's funny.
As an external processor, it's very difficult. But thankfully, I have friends that listen to me talk, like Emily. What I think that it's really important here is, like you said, that energy, we can feel it, right? Like if we're excited about a topic, that energy shines through, especially when it comes to the audio format. You can hear the excitement in someone's voice if they're passionate about it or if they're having an off day. You can tell. And there's so much power in that, right? In being able to express yourself in such a fun and excited way and be able to hear the smile in someone's voice. But when you, like you said, when you do have those episodes where it's like, man, they definitely were not in it today, and I'm just going to be skipping today, you know? You don't want your audience to do that. Now, taking it a little step further, so that's kind of like a good starting point. When we're thinking about the kinds of content that we're creating and the different types of people, right, that might be listening, how do we make sure that the content we're creating addresses you have like 4 types of curious people, right, that we can talk through, addresses each of those types of people?
Yeah. So one more thing, I really want to make sure that we address this too, because you're right about that energy. And I think it comes through with the guests that we choose too.
Yeah.
So this is why it's so important for you to pitch the right podcast, be a guest on the right podcast, and have the right guests on your show, because that comes through in your interviews. And I am curious about a lot of people. So there's a lot of room in there. But when it's something that I'm just like definitely turned off by or definitely skeptical about, people notice. So just keep that in mind as a podcast guest. But speaking to the 4 types of curious people. So this again is not an original thought. There are like a classic 4 types of curious people, and your audience would fall into one of those 4 types typically, but there could be some overlap, right? So there's the fascinated, and that's just the kind of person that like approaches all kinds of different topics with awe and wonder. And like, these are the people that will just go deep on this random topic. Like they have a tab on their computer where they've been researching, like, I don't know, different brands of dog food for like a week. They're just interested in like what they're interested in at that moment, but it could range greatly from day to day. The empathizer is the person that's like really fascinated in personality, really fascinated in other people. They really want to learn about other people and emotions and all of the different facets that make us human. I am an empathizer. Spoiler alert. Then there is the problem solver. And that's a person that's like, they're really curious when it comes to how to solve particular problems and issues and resolve things. And they are going to follow that thread of curiosity. They could follow a lot of those same paths as the fascinated, but it's usually a little bit more specific. And then there's the avoider. And this is the person that generally does not have a high level of curiosity, maybe not high level of self-awareness. They're probably not reading a ton of books, and they're probably not listening to a ton of podcasts. So it's important to remember that those people are out there too, and you may actually be speaking to some of them.
Yeah, and that's really interesting in breaking down our listeners, right? And I feel like there might be a little bit of everyone in your listenership. So it might be really important to cater your content, which we'll talk about how to do that, cater your content to each of those people really in strategic ways and this is the part, right, where it's like, well, if I need to show up a certain way, then maybe I lose my excitement because I'm in the back of my head. I'm thinking about how I need to show up this way. First of all, take a deep breath. Calm down. It's okay. And Emily's going to give us fantastic tips and strategies on how to still be ourselves and show up awesomely for each of these types of people. So if we're talking about our audience being mostly fascinated types of people, and they're fascinated by things, what kind of content do you think that we should be creating for them?
So that's where I think that wide breadth of different content would be really, really helpful for that kind of person. So for my podcast, She Built This, I tend to fill that bucket the most, let's say. Like I do bring on a lot of various topics with things that I may not know about, but I'm the empathizer, right? So I'm curious about the things that make the people tick. And so I can pull those things out for the people that are fascinators.
So I'm thinking like, maybe it's a true crime podcast, or maybe it's, like your podcast where it does cover, even thinking of like the big names, like Jenna Kutcher, Amy Porterfield, Marie Forleo, people like that are like bigger names. They might be talking about something specific, but they talk about a lot of different topics as well. And maybe this is more the problem solver, but yes, it's somewhat focused, but there's still a wide breadth to what they're talking about. Is that what you're thinking? Or is it more like I said, the true crime podcast?
No, I think the true crime podcast would kind of fall into that more focused problem solver. So the breadth is just a little bit smaller. And I think that for the problem solver, it would be really helpful to have those kind of tangible, practical action steps forward. Like I think of your podcast a lot in this way. It's very problem solver podcast. Like Alicia can even name for you an episode that solves any problem for you that comes to your podcast. She's like, I have an episode on that. Here's the answer. And she does it in a really beautiful human way. It solves a lot of our problems as podcasters. So it's like very specific and very niche.
That makes sense for sure. And definitely shows the difference, right? In that, like the more business one, Business Made Easy, or, those like ones that are Entrepreneurs on Fire, something like those kinds of podcasts, Gary Vaynerchuk type of content. Like it's very wide in the topics being discussed, still a little focused in that it's business stuff, but a lot wider. Before we move on to the problem solver, knowing in our minds that there might be some fascinators listening to our podcast, how can we kind of spike their curiosity?
I think that bringing some of those bigger conversations to the table, and maybe that's not you, that is the host that can do that, so maybe you do bring on a guest that covers just some wider breadth of topic, and formulating your questions in a way that provides a really wide scope of the whole thing, not just like a solution to a problem or a framework or step by step.
I like that. So I'm thinking of like people I've had on my show, or maybe especially as we talk to like a lot of podcasters, obviously they're in different industries, they have different topics. And so I'm thinking of someone that like has a big business and it specifically talks to the Facebook group type people. And like, they're a lot broader in their topics, but I can have that person on and say, hey, we're going to talk specifically about the podcast. You might whittle in a little bit of these other topics, but in the end, if they want to find out more about your broader scope, then they can go listen to your podcast. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Love that. So moving on to the problem solver, what kind of content can we create for these people?
Simple, actionable, practical, based in like fact and information. So these are a good opportunity for you as a thought leader or as an expert in your field to do kind of some of those solo episodes where you're walking someone through a framework, or you're walking them through 5 clear steps or 5 tips for. It's that kind of thing. You know who does a really good job of this? Her name is Tanessa Shears, and she has a podcast called Becoming Limitless, and it is focused on health. And she just gives like these mind-blowingly scientific breakdowns of what's happening in my body at what time of month. And it's like amazing, actionable steps that I can like literally map out on a spreadsheet if I wanted to.
Oh, I love that. So really looking at the numbers, and obviously as a data person, like I like that kind of stuff. Awesome. If we're someone who maybe struggles with doing some solo episodes, is there a way to like approach that, but maybe from a different standpoint, having a guest on?
I think a guest that has expertise in a certain area that you really want to bring forth to your audience is such a great way to do that. I don't know about, I'll use ClickFunnels as an example. I don't particularly care, but I think that a lot of my audience might care, and they might want some really practical steps, not just like philosophy on ClickFunnels. So I would bring somebody on to speak to specifically to that, or specifically for networking on LinkedIn, things in that vein, because I don't know those things and I don't want to just, make something up essentially, which I would be doing.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I do like that approach a lot. So moving on to the empathizer, how can we create content for this person?
I think that the way to create content for the empathizer is to really make sure that you're, as a podcast guest, showing up with like your human side of things, like showing some of your personality, showing some of your humanness, and connecting to your audience in that way through stories and analogies and metaphors. But also, what's a great example of this is somebody that brings someone on to tell like their life journey or their life story or highlight their story as an entrepreneur. Like we're really getting to the root of the human behind the business or the human that made this happen. So things like that. There was the podcast, How I Built This, actually kind of does that. He kind of takes people's, like the founder of Whole Foods, for example, he tells his life story, or the founder of Stonyfield Yogurt. They take their life story and they explain it. And it's like the human behind this big, big brand and this big business that is now respected.
You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together. Yeah, and like really bringing it to a relatable level, I think, is where that empathizer can really feel and like kind of tap into like, oh, if they can do it, then why can't I? Which I think is really important in creating that curiosity.
And another way to do this, I guess, would be to think of some ways that the information could apply to different people and saying like, this is how you could apply this if you're this type of person. Lisa Zarotny does a great job of this. This is how you could apply this if you're this kind of person. This is how you could apply it if you're this kind of person. So it's just bringing in like kind of bringing the audience into the discussion as human beings alongside you.
Yes. And Lisa Zarotny is the host of Positively Living podcast. So highly recommend that if you're someone who wants to be more productive in your life. So love her stuff. Moving on to the avoider. Obviously, we don't want a lot of avoiders in our audience, but they're still there, right? They might be listening very passively. How do we kind of cater to them? Not entirely, right? Like we don't want to cater our content to the avoider entirely. But if we are trying to kind of bring them in, if they're already there, how can we do that with our content?
I think that raising some questions that help to increase their awareness of themselves. So this might be more of an episode that is actually focused on a particular problem, but it's not giving necessarily solutions to the problem yet. It's just sort of raising awareness about the problem. I listened to somebody's podcast this morning that was called Cut Yourself Some Slack, and it was showing you who you might be if you're the kind of person that needs to cut yourself some slack. I'm not an avoider, but it spoke to me because I was like, oh, this is something I hadn't even considered. Like I didn't have awareness around it yet. So it opened up my awareness to the fact that maybe I need to cut myself a little bit of slack. So it's things like that.
Oh, I love that. And that's a really great point, right? Because obviously, as we're developing and growing as humans, as people, there will be parts of our life that we maybe avoid, right? Or we don't want to touch, or that we're not aware of yet, or problem aware. And so bringing that content in a way that's like, hey, you might have this problem, without being like step-by-step guide, right? Because they're not going to care about that. They're just going to want a maybe more philosophical kind of approach. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. And also maybe transformational too, showing them what the possibility is. Like maybe life doesn't have to be how it is for them, but they don't know what is even there, like what is bothering them. It's a blind spot, right? So showing them like what it's possible that it could be like also helps to raise that awareness.
And like, as we're talking, I feel like there are ways within a month's worth of content to bring all of this in a way that doesn't feel like, oh man, I got to talk to the fascinators today,
I agree. As we were talking, I was actually like, ooh, wouldn't it be fun to try one a week that was specific to each person? But I think you're right. I think it can be naturally part of any conversation because first of all four of these, like many of the personality constructs that we talk about, it's in all of us, right? So we all have parts of this. Like there are things we all avoid. There are things we all just look at because we want to solve a problem. There are things we all just have fascination and awe around. And there are things about people that we're all interested in, things that we're not. So we can bring those into every single conversation that we have.
Yeah. And it can come naturally. I feel like it doesn't have to be something where it's more about just being aware of it and making sure maybe you do a slight check on your content in the last 6 months. Have you approached each of these in the conversations that you've had? And maybe is there space for you to add in some curiosity? Is there such thing as too much curiosity?
Well, so that's kind of what I was talking about at the beginning with that too much heat, right? Like too much heat in the soup that I made. You don't want to turn people off by just making them be like, what? Like, what are you talking about? I don't even understand. It has to be clear and concise. And I do see people with this where they're just, you know what? Part of it is they're just not using specific language. And so there's a certain way that some people speak that is you need like a decoder to figure out what they're saying. And I think it's maybe when you're trying to talk over people or something like that, but just boil things down. Like talk to us like human beings and people. And that's how you can eliminate some of that creating too much curiosity. I think I was using that as more of like, don't create confusion when you're trying to create curiosity.
Yeah. And that definitely makes sense. And that's why I think it's really important to like bring that up again here, because we've talked through like, here's how you should do it. And these are the things you should do, but also like, it's okay. Take a breath. We can figure this out together. It's not going to be too difficult. What are some things that we should avoid and some things that we should do when it comes to kind of approaching this?
Yeah. So one thing I would recommend that people avoid, and this speaks to what we just talked about, is avoiding complex language and jargon. Even if your listeners, let's say you're a massage therapist, even if your listeners have gotten massages their entire life, they probably still don't really understand what like myofascial release is. Like you don't need to use words like that. So what is a way that we can use? I struggle with it sometimes as a content writer. Like even the word ClickFunnels is a little bit like not everyone knows what that is. So what's a way we can say that just makes sense to everybody? It's not dumbing it down. It's just leaving like the industry jargon, which also, not for nothing, a lot of when we hear these terms repeated over and over and over again, these buzz terms, they become nothing, right? So even like the word authentic, why are we all scared to say it? It's because everybody says it. We still like the word, we like the meaning, but every single person says it. So that's sort of what I try to do with my own title too. Like as a content writer, I'm like, how can I say this in a different way? I write stuff.
I write awesome stuff.
Yeah. So it's that. It's avoiding complex and industry jargon that really is just going to talk over people's head, confuse people, and maybe cause them to tune out. You know, nobody wants to get their dictionary out while they're listening to your podcast.
Yeah, no thank you. Please, and no thank you.
Or if you are going to bring jargon into the language, define what it is. Define what it is to you, define what it might be to other people. You know, give a really good, clear picture of what it is, and then you can start using it. Don't just dive right into some term that I don't know.
Yes. And I think this is really important, especially in conversations on podcasts, right? Because people are doing other things while they're listening to you. And so they don't have time to double click and be like, hey, what's that word mean? You know, you have to expound on it. You have to explain it. You have to give examples to feed all of, like, we were talking about all these different parts of the curiosity that we have within us. What are some other things that we should avoid as we are creating this content?
Okay, so this is a fun one. And I try to remember this in whatever I'm writing and producing, not to lead the witness. So at the end of a conversation, I don't want someone to feel like I just shoulded them, needed to, had to. I don't want them to feel like, oh my God, now I feel so overwhelmed and frazzled. I want them to just like have their awareness expanded so that they can see the possibility, so that they want to take the next step. So leading the witness also might look like answering questions for people. And that's sort of when you give that generalized answer, one size fits all kind of thing. So I would avoid leading the witness, which doesn't actually maybe even solve their specific problem. Maybe it doesn't even solve it in its entirety, but it does open up the possibility of what it could look like to have that solution.
And it allows them to still be curious, right? So if we don't lead the witness specifically, they don't have room to be curious because you're just adding them and you're just talking at them rather than inviting them into the conversation, which I think is really a part of being a podcaster, is inviting the audience, inviting the listener to consider, to be curious about the things that you're talking about rather than saying, this is how you should do it and this is the only way to do it, right? We want to approach the content that we're creating ethically, right? And I think that a lot of people who are consuming content have gotten smarter. They have gotten more fed up with the sleazy sales tactics. And so it's really important that, especially as business owners, that the things that we're creating do create that curiosity rather than telling them what to do.
And one really easy way to do this, I love asking people like, if you agreed or disagreed with anything in this conversation, or if you have a unique perspective or a takeaway, like I want to hear what it is, because I love to hear things from all sides of the coin, all 6 sides of the coin. So I love to ask them what they think and not close that loop, like not give you, well, here's my opinion.
Yes. No, that's definitely such a great reminder. Is there anything else that you feel like we missed that we should talk about with this conversation?
I think just a reminder to show your personality in your content, because that's a huge and really fun way to create curiosity. So I'll quote Seth Godin. He shares this quote where he says that don't try to make something for everybody because those products are for nobody. Like the only thing we really have that differentiates us from one another is ourselves. And so showing yourself to your people, like that is why we keep listening to podcasts, is because of the host. So I think that that's just a really important reminder. It's just show pieces of your personality and when applicable, use personal stories. Alicia and I have been using them throughout this episode and just make that connection with your audience on a really personal level.
Such a great reminder. That has been really helpful. Emily, thank you so much for being on today. Where can everyone find you, hang out with you, get to know you?
Thank you. This was so fun. So if you are curious about me, you can learn more at emilyaborn.com. And that has links to everything I do on social and the podcasts and everything from there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.